I'm so annoyed that we started 2026 by I was relaxing and then a bunch of guys rolled into my secret cave where I play Crusader Kings 3 All Under Heaven. And then they black bagged me and they dragged me back to the TF studio where I'm now being forced at gunpoint to record a podcast.
All of us have been black bagged, flex cuffed, and then dragged in front of our podcasting microphones back to work after the holiday. And I have to condemn this as an unprecedented violation of international law that will surely make the world less safe.
Well, that's how they're bringing people back to the office. They're just like, you know, if we have to do it, we're kidnapping you and putting you in your cubicle.
I'm a tier 1 anti-work from home operator.
You think that they're joking? No, I'm even on this fucking episode. We're all in the goddamn detention cell.
We're all wearing we're all wearing our Nike Tech.
Kind of a surreal video podcast that we're doing when none of us can see anything because we all have blindfolds on, but we've got the great big microphones that every podcaster ever has. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the worst part for Riley was they put him in the gray Nike sweatsuit and he was like, I would never wear this voluntarily. Fuck off. They like zip up the Nike jacket on you and you're like thrashing against the restraints.
No! I'll tell you anything. No, the worst part, of course, is that I was hoping that we would get taken by the Lib SEAL Special Forces, but we got taken by the Chud Delta Special Forces.
So this is the thing. You and I were talking about this beforehand. This, like Maduro, which is we're going to spend the whole episode talking about. Maduro got taken by Delta Force partially because like Trump likes them more, and like it's interesting, right? Because the Navy SEALs obviously also Chuds, but under the Obama administration, they were able to sort of market themselves upwards very effectively as like, you know, here is your elite surgical philosopher king strike package, sir, right?
Which is extremely funny if you've ever encountered Navy SEAls, which I have, because like they're basically like the best way I could describe it is, what if the Khmer Rouge were surfers?
But they were able to like clean themselves up for kind of like in order to sell themselves as like the guys to do that stuff. And now, of course, it's a different era. Woke is gone, and with Hegseth and with Trump in office, it's now Delta, the army guys, being like, look how many push-ups these guys can do.
Well, yeah, because Hegseth basically has more or less the same amount of military experience that I have, except I'm not like, I'm the fucking warrior king and I'm going to be a secretary of defense.
Gigantic Jerusalem cross tattoo.
I'm just a random ass dude fucking who knows how to use microphone preamps. And he's also an alcoholic and a psychopath and a violent abuser. And it does make sense. I hadn't thought of that, but it does make sense that I'm Team Army, thus I use Team Army's cool guys, thus I use SFOD Delta as opposed to...
I think it's also funny, right? Because although those two units might be sort of culturally broadly interchangeable, it's really one of the funniest outcomes of this to me would be embedding a kind of like partisan American Janissary class where it's like SEALs are the woke special forces unit and Delta is the Chud one. And so if you're like, oh, you know, at 1 a.m. waking up in a cold sweat hearing helicopters, you have to listen to see whether or not they're playing We Are Charlie Kirk out of the loudspeaker, or if there's a little sign attached to the side that says, in this Black Hawk we believe.
I mean, to be honest with you, if you want the real annoying military like internal commentary, at the time the Bin Laden raid was absolutely not SEAL sort of domain. Like in terms of what Delta is and what they were designed to do, it is 100% that. It's just that there was a guy who was a former SEAL at the head of JSOC at the time. Like if you're going to send people in to do like a direct action raid like this and then immediately egress, like that's 100% Delta. Like the politics of it are fucked to the point where like I'm like, this is the most shameful Call of Duty level I've ever watched in my life, because it seems so fucking surreal, but it's real and it's like an absolute moral crime, and I am mortified by it.
We're not going to get woke too, but we might get like neo-lib too. And if we do, I look forward to being black bagged by the lib special forces, where it's a bunch of guys with plate carriers and Columbia quarter zips underneath. It's like boots on the back of my neck, and I'm like feeling the tread pattern. I'm like, are those Sperry's?
Well, they're actually going to be they're a little happier and thus less likely to do some kind of like absurd abusing detainees to you, because at least they got to leave Fayetteville, North Carolina to go on this mission to black bag you.
We need to be egressing to the Deloitte Pride float at 0700.
It's like, at least I'm not in Southern Pines right now. I can do something cool. I can go to Glasgow and raid a tower block like that Indonesian kung fu movie.
So in a second, we're actually going to be talking a little bit about the history, context, and likely future of American intervention in South America with Jana Silverman, who's a professor of international relations at UFABC in Brazil and on the DSA International Committee co-chair as well.
Yeah, that's where we store all this like serious stuff. If you're like, why aren't they doing serious analysis of this? Why are they doing bits about seals wearing quarter zips?
Yeah, that's coming. But first, we just want to extend the Fell For It Again award of the podcast to, of course, Maria Corina Machado.
Yeah,
that is right.
Yeah. We talk about it on the interview, but like the two most cucked groups in all of this being the kind of Venezuelan dissident democracy pro sort of overthrow movement and Europe. And I appreciate that a great deal.
So, but this was a quote. This was actually published by the Nobel Prize Twitter account while like Mike Vining Jr. was flying over Caracas in a helicopter.
A bunch of guys are like fast roping directly onto Maduro's bed. The Nobel Peace Prize Twitter account is like fearlessgirl.jpg.
Yeah, this is the quote. Freedom is not something we wait for, but something we become. It is a personal choice, and the sum of those choices forms the civic ethos that must be renewed every day.
Yeah, this is the same as my college application essay, where it's like, if I tell them I'm gay, I'll definitely get in.
Save the world, my final message. This is a level of like soy in the face of like preposterously epic operator guy I last saw at the end of the movie Sicario.
Soy in the face of danger is such a great concept. Oh my god.
So this is I guess Maria Corina Machado in realizing that like because Trump got the FIFA Peace Prize and she got the Nobel Peace Prize, Trump saw her as upstaging him and therefore was like, get her out of here. Only the FIFA Prize winner's allowed to invade Venezuela. The Nobel means nothing. Now she's just like on whatever Kamala Harris was on. Like whoever opposes Donald Trump is doomed to talk like that. So yeah, this was actually from the FT. Mr. Trump had never warmed to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Machado, who'd organized a presidential campaign in 2024, earning her the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Since Mr. Trump's re-election, Machado has gone out of her way to praise him, calling him a champion of freedom, mimicking his talking points on election fraud in the United States, and even dedicating her Peace Prize to him.
It's so fucking sad to be like, yeah, I want to be president and I want to get rid of the dictator, and that obliges me to like hang out with Donald Trump and be like, yeah, the fucking Somali daycare fraud or whatever is very bad, Mr. President. And then after all that, he still doesn't respect you because weirdly Trump respects strength and this does not project strength. He should have tried being a handsome man. That's the only thing he cares about.
Yeah. It's not too late. Maria Machado.
There is still time.
There is still time, Maria Machado. You could be president of Venezuela. You know what you must do.
We're about to find out in real time whether or not T-Boy swag is enough to work on Donald Trump.
This is the worst Pedro Almodovar movie I've ever seen.
So we're going to talk with Dr. Silverman just now, and then we're going to be back in a little while to do a little bit more sort of speculation on the MAGA Kremlinology, look at different world leader responses, and wonder what the fuck's going to come next. So without any further ado, I throw to us. So I'm going to take us into the interview portion of our segment by welcoming Jana Silverman, who's the professor of international relations at UFABC in Brazil, DSA International Committee co-chair, and all around knower more about of all of the things that we're going to be discussing here on the podcast today. Jana, welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Live from perhaps the most remote place we've ever talked to a guest before. To kick us off, I want to read from an article. This is actually from November 19th in the New York Times, entitled, Trump said to authorize CIA plans for covert action in Venezuela. And I think the two paragraphs in this article are essentially the essence of what's happening. And we could use that to go into a little bit of history. So here are the paragraphs. While Mr. Trump emphasizes Venezuela's role in the drug trade or illegal immigration when he discusses the issue in public, he has discussed in private the country's huge oil reserves and American companies gaining access to them. Venezuelan officials have told Americans that Mr. Maduro Maduro may be willing to step down after a transition of 2 to 3 years, according to people briefed in the matter. However, a delay in Mr. Maduro's giving up power is considered a non-starter with the White House, which continues to build up in the region. So let's just starting from there, right? We have resources. We have, I'd say, a blatant power grab for those resources, the direct management of the governance in another country by the United States. Let's seat this a little bit in history. I think before we started the show, Jana, you mentioned the 1989 ouster of Noriega in Panama. But we've also been talking about gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century, sort of comprador regimes in the 1920s. Let's put like the American perception of itself as the main electoral force, if you like, in South and Central America in a historical context.
Sure, of course. So obviously, it all goes back a little bit further, right? 1823, which is the December 1823, James Monroe announces his famous doctrine, which again, is a lot of controversy about it, about how much it really called for direct intervention by the United States in Latin America at that time, or is more just asserting the fact that it was under a sphere of influence and trying to keep out other European imperial powers at the time, namely countries like Spain. Spain was already there, but France, Britain, etc. Fast forward a little bit, and you start seeing a sort of more aggressive interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine over time, especially after the United States passes through its own internal conflicts in the 1860s during the Civil War, right? So this is where you see, again, these famous cases of gunboat diplomacy, which again tend to happen more in the areas with more geographical proximity to the United States, right? So we are talking about the Caribbean. We're obviously talking about Mexico. We're obviously talking about Central America, and we're obviously talking about Venezuela. And when we mean gunboat democracy, it literally diplomacy. Sorry, it literally meant the United States sending warships either directly as a government or privatized through other, what they called at the time, filibusters. I know today we use filibuster it has a different meaning, right? But literally filibusters were, these sort of private agents who came in and, invaded countries. This literally happened in Nicaragua, and I believe it was the 1870s, where it was governed by an American for 2 years. And I believe it was the Taft government that actually recognized it diplomatically. So this happened in Venezuela. And again, it's also important to mention that it wasn't just the United States that was doing this. Britain did this quite often mostly to make good on debts, sovereign debts that these countries held. Because again, going back a little bit further again, in the early 19th century, 1810s, 1820s, that's when all these countries were having their wars of independence. Venezuela played a particularly important role. It was the home of the birthplace of Simón Bolívar, which was the liberator of most of South America, right? But these countries these newly independent countries in the 1820s and 1830s entered into massive debt, to be able to pay their armies, establish working governments, hire police, those kind of basic functions, set up schools, etc. So again, depending on where these countries were located geographically in the region, some had stronger ties, financial and political ties with Britain in particular, like we're talking Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, and then the ones closer to the United States, like Venezuela, like Mexico, like Central America, had their principal ties with the United States. And then fast forward a little bit more, we get to the 1890s. So who comes into the scene? Teddy Roosevelt, right? And he creates the infamous, I would say, Roosevelt Corollary, which basically states very clearly that the United States now gives itself the right to preemptively invade countries and take political control over Latin American countries if they discord with the way they are governing themselves, either politically or economically. And that takes its material expression in the Spanish Civil War, right? Which is, what I think it lasted about 2-3 months, where the United States comes in, kind of does this trick. It tries to say that it was allied with the Cuban independence forces. What in reality, it wants to take, it wants to get the Spanish out and obtain more direct political and economic control over the island. And you have, so that they win the war very, very easily, quickly, in, like I said, in about 3 months. And Cuba becomes nominally an independent country. And there's also an interesting story about that. Cuba could have been, the 51st or whatever number state it would have been at the time. But there was a lot of backlash by U.S. politicians at the time because they felt that there were too many Afro-Cubans in the island and it would mess up this quote-unquote racial balance in the United States to incorporate Cuba as a state. So that's why it was not incorporated. It became an independent state nominally, but you had the Platt Amendment, which was incorporated into the Cuban Constitution, I believe it was 1902, 1903, which basically said that the United States had a right to, again, directly intervene in Cuban politics, Cuban affairs, if they discorded with the way that the government was handling things, even though Cuba was, again, a nominally independent state. And so that's when Puerto Rico becomes a colony, in addition to Philippines, Guam, etc. So all that to say that, and this is, again, skipping over Mexico, which would be a whole, hour of podcast in and of itself about the history of U.S.-Mexican intervention, right? So all that to say that U.S. presence in the region, in this sort of aggressive, sort of unilateral perspective has been very, very obvious, I would say since the mid-19th century. So what they're doing in Venezuela, long story short, is nothing new.
It struck me that in some ways, this kidnapping had more in common with the sort of 19th century, early 20th century interventions than the sort of later 20th century ones. As far as I can remember, it's the first time in many decades that the US has intervened directly in South America as opposed to Central America, rather than through using sort of those own countries' militaries or, the CIA sort of overt American military action. It's sort of like testing my memory for anything this sort of brazen and this resource focused. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, if we get to fast forward again to the mid 20th century, we're at the height of the Cold War, and that's when you see a series of very aggressive U.S. interventions. But again, not all those U.S. interventions are explicitly or entirely military. This all starts in the 1950s with the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, who was the sort of the second left-leaning president of the country of Guatemala, which was sort of a test of how the U.S. would intervene in years to come in places like Indonesia, Iran, and then later Brazil. Brazil becomes the next test in 1964. And what you do is you get this kind of combination of, they set up military cooperation. They set up these sort of think tanks to sort of spread this idea of, anti-communism among the intellectuals, among the population in general. And so what you have, and the United States actually goes to the point of actually stationing large gunboats out, right outside of Rio de Janeiro, the day of the coup, which happens again on April 1st, 1964. But they don't actually have to go in and militarily intervene because the Brazilian army does it for them. And this is kind of a similar pattern that then repeats in places like Uruguay in 1973, Chile in 1973, Argentina in 1976, etc. Right? So you are right. You don't see as much, again, it's not that there isn't military intervention. It's just not troops on the ground per se. And to be fair, that's not what we saw either, right? We saw this sort of quote unquote surgical strike happening, which I would say is maybe more akin to what we saw in the operation against Osama bin Laden than a full-scale military invention, compared to what we saw in Nicaragua in the 1870s, right?
It's interesting to me as well in that if you compare it to the sort of interventions of the 60s and 70s, there isn't a sort of a Cold War block there, the kind of threat that Venezuela could pose to the US that's been confected of sort of like drug trafficking, or sometimes it's sort of stretched to Iran and Hezbollah as well. There's not anything as sort of like as proximate as there was with with Cuba or with Chile or anywhere else. And it really seems so much more, I don't know, distracted in some ways. It seems so much more like there's no kind of need to legitimize this or claim any kind of legitimacy for it, that's the part that feels like a kind of a throwback to me.
To me also, I'm reminded of 1983 in Grenada, just because of the fact that was seen as, if I recall correctly, even the United Kingdom government privately expressed displeasure at Reagan for having invaded Grenada and overthrown the government, and then left, if I remember correctly, not too long after. I also was reminded of Honduras in 2009, where the military arrested Manuel Zelaya, but it wasn't the U.S. military, even though the U.S. does have a presence in Honduras. It was the Honduran Supreme Court said that Zelaya's plan for a constituent assembly was illegal, and then the military came into his house and arrested him at gunpoint and put him on a plane. And that, to me, I was like, but I agree with everything you're saying, that like it's strange to see the U.S. do this specifically against the head of state out of nowhere. And the times that it's happened in the past, like you were saying, Jana, it's more like what happened when in Pakistan in 2011 versus something that we've seen in the United States, in recent decades. It's just kind of, there's just something very surreal about it, but I definitely feel like there's this kind of rhyming precedent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if we're going to look at U.S. interventions, in Latin America, and again, military and non, sort of overtly militarily, right? Because I think that was great, Nate, that you just mentioned, the first, I would say, kind of U.S.-backed coup, because let's call it what it was, even though that was during the, quote-unquote, liberal Obama administration in 2009 in Honduras. Let's remember, shortly after that, 2012, you had a very, very, sort of strange parliamentary coup that lasted for 24 hours to ouster the only left-leaning president in the history of Paraguay, Fernando Lugo. That happened. And then, shortly after that, you have the coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, which was, the most shocking, right? And then after that, you start seeing this series of, what we call lawfare, right? Which, where are they learning this from? The Department of Justice. And again, this is not conspiracy theory. There were all the, the leaked texts and information that was uncovered, years ago by Glenn Greenwald, showing the direct collusion between, the judge that ended up prosecuting Lula and involved directly in the sort of political movement to oust Dilma in Brazil with the DOJ, right? So again, I would say, we're on one level, that this attack against Maduro was shocking because it was a directly military attack on a certain level, right? On the other hand, it's not shocking at all, right? Because they've been doing this, basically for all of U.S. modern history under different guises. And getting back to, the issue of motives, right? I mean, I would say, and again, maybe being an academic, sometimes we tend to overthink things. I think there is a sort of ideological underpinning. I think that's why Marco Rubio in particular is so, gung-ho on this. And that's why he's got his sights on Cuba next, right? Even though, the main countries that actually export drugs into the United States. Obviously Mexico is a stopping point, but the main producers of drugs, in addition to Colombia, are Peru and Ecuador, which are both ruled by right-wing governments right now. So I think there is an issue about, U.S. hegemony being weakened, right? How has Venezuela survived over the last 9 years of, after being heavily sanctioned and basically being outside of the sort of the world financial system because of U.S. financial sanctions? They've survived because of Russia and China, right? What is the number one trading partner of literally every country in South America right now? It is China. So I think, again, maybe it's not so ideological in this idea, battle of ideas between capitalism and quote unquote communism, but it is about hegemony, right? It's about the ascension of the BRIC, right? So it isn't just, obviously narco trafficking. It's just they're grasping against straws. It's about oil. I think on a certain level, it could also be about, immigration, Venezuela, over 8 million Venezuelans have migrated out of the country, again, in the last 10 years or so because of the economic crisis caused in part by sanctions. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out also when looking at Cuba and Mexico. But obviously, and it's certainly not about democracy, right? We all know, Venezuelan democracy is just as flawed as, lots of other partners in the region, your U.S. partners like El Salvador, like Peru itself, right? Never mind, places in other regions like Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. So.
This is like a very quick question on my part, because I'd like your opinion. I'd really like to hear your opinion about like why are like establishment, like media outlets kind of like saying that this is, this at least part of it is like is a sort of attempt to kind of restore democracy or bring democracy when like everyone in the administration is basically overtly saying, no, it absolutely isn't. Like we are very clear about what we want. And also like I did see a very compelling case, which I'm not saying is true, but it would be very fitting for this administration to be like, yeah, they went for Maduro because like he kept doing the Trump dance and kept mocking him and his drip was too fresh. His girl was too bad, etc. Like that's, I'm not actually like I'm convinced that might be one of the reasons why they were just like, fuck this guy. You know, there are lots of other reasons for doing it, but like the final straw is him doing the Trump dance better than Trump.
Well, I just watched that Trump dance last night, and I have to say it is pretty damn cool. So what I would say about that is, like, on one level, right, you know, Trump's foreign policy, when it's totally concentrated in him and making these big decisions, it's completely unpredictable, just like all of his policy, right? You know, like, I think a lot of it has to, you know, again, a lot of it is based on sort of his own personal reactions and opinions, you know, like, let's, you know, another example, certainly a lot less drastic, right? You know, 4 months ago, you know, the United States had slapped a ton of tariffs on Brazil, right? You know, Latin America's largest economy. And then, you know, 2 months later, after Trump and Lula hook up at the UN General Assembly meeting, and suddenly they're like best buddies. And, you know, a few weeks later, you know, almost all the tariffs are gone. So again, you know, I wouldn't completely discount the Trump dance theory, right? You know, but in terms of like his decision to like pull the trigger, right? You know, but I think obviously in the lead up to it, like that was not the factor, right? You know, they can, I mean, let's say, you know, like on a certain level, the United States has been planning this literally for years, if not, you know, over a decade, you know, like, and again, talking about not necessarily militarily, again, like talking about interventions by USAID and NED funded programming, you know, to undermine, you know, the Chavista project, you know, obviously the economic sanctions causing chaos in the country. Like, these are all things that led up to, you know, this sort of last straw, right, which was the direct military intervention. But again, you know, I think it's more, to me, you know, again, this isn't going to solve anything regarding narco trafficking. It's certainly not going to bring back, quote unquote, democracy in Venezuela, even though, you know, again, I totally agree. A lot of like sort of legacy media has been like repeating that, as well as the European Union, right? It's about the United States reasserting its control of Latin America and saying this is still our backyard. You know, I definitely think it's more about, you know, the Donroe doctrine than it is about, you know, like the using narco trafficking to kind of appease domestic audiences, but it has nothing to do with
it. I was thinking about this the other day because, like, when the inauguration, as in the Trump inauguration happened, like one of the things that he had said in his speech that I think is like really telling of just what this current administration is like, but something that was kind of overlooked was just like how resentful he was about like what he sort of perceived to be all the ailments of like his movement, and the fact that he was blaming other people and blaming other countries, you know. And this was like very much at the heart of like his governance, like in this time, which is that, other countries and other institutions and like secret forces are sort of undermining like American dominance, American hegemony, and the only way that you can solve them is through force. And so what we're going to do is like we're going to try stuff like sanctions, but that will be the last straw in terms of like non-military intervention. And like if the sanctions didn't sort of, you know, as you mentioned, like, you know, the sanctions were basically unworkable for the most part. They've sort of like harmed Americans, and they've harmed like you know, I think it probably has had a really big impact on like his domestic kind of popularity even among his own base. And so I do wonder whether the next step of like his, you know, being guided by this resentment is now just like, okay, all the options to do like non-violent bullying, that's off the table, and now we're just going to use like all of like American military power, which has been built up like, you know, over the course. You know, this is not a sort of Trump project in and of itself. Like, you know, as you sort of mentioned, like Obama and Biden have kind of paved the way for this, but it would make sense for someone like him to be like, okay, well, we just have like all this military power and no one can really stop us. So like, why is no one using it? Like, it's a completely rational like Trump response to like the tariffs kind of not yielding the benefits that he necessarily wanted it to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think about like, how does the U.S. like maintain its quote unquote exceptionalism, right? You know, for years it's maintained it through economics, right? And that clearly like that's slipping and it's not coming back. You know, obviously, you know, the sort of competitive advantage that China has due to a number of reasons, not just, you know, low cost of labor, but also, you know, their advances in research and development. You know, like they spend so much more on science and technology per capita than the United States does, right? You know, and then other forms of U.S. hegemony, soft power, right? The idea of like using this cultural soft power, you know, above and beyond like Hollywood, right? Like you do that through foreign aid, right? And Trump completely dismantled U.S. aid, right? And other forms of ways of showing, you know, how the U.S. is like this nice, you know, benevolent hegemon, right, in the world. Although it is important to mention that at, you know, even though 90 or something, you know, over 90% of USAID's programming was completely dismantled, the programming in Venezuela and Cuba well, was not entirely, right? That was put back on the table just explicitly by Marco Rubio. And then, so what is left? If you lose, and then political hegemony. Again, U.S. is losing its political hegemony through the BRIC, right? Not necessarily, not because we're necessarily seeing a return to some kind of multilateral world, but certainly bilateral, again, with the ascent of China. And so what is the U.S. left with? Military hegemony. And that's the only sort of type of power that, uncontestedly, that the United States still has an upper advantage on than any other country in the world. And so I think I totally agree. We can't win over their hearts and minds, so let's just bomb the hell out of them.
I'm curious as well what you make of the sort of various little reports that have emerged here and there of this kind of process of negotiation that maybe was happening at some level, either with Maduro or with other elements of the Venezuelan government, and that is now kind of happening out in public, where the White House is trying to sort of coerce Maduro's vice president into sort of like doing what they want, which seems mostly to be oil focused. And that sort of reminded me again, very sort of like 1920s, 1930s sort of comprador stuff. And I just wonder what you make of it.
Yeah, no, I think that was real. I again, to what level those talks were held and advanced is another question. But let's keep in mind also, I want to say about 3-4 years ago, in 2021, early 2022, when the United States was kind of confronting really high oil prices, or really high oil prices for the United States, and I mean oil in the sense of gasoline at the pump, right? What consumers are paying. The Biden administration entered into talks with the Venezuelans, right? It was interestingly brokered by the Qatari, which is, again, another, we could talk about that later. Why them,
there's sort of niche they've carved out for themselves.
Exactly, right. But so, and it actually had some progress, right? They increased the amount of oil that Venezuela could export to the United States to kind of alleviate the pressure, the price pressure at the pumps, right? But then, again, the sort of once that problem gets quote unquote resolved, Biden clamps the sanctions back on. And obviously, Trump's continued that. But is that, even though there aren't official diplomatic relations with, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the United States for quite some time now, these informal, channels do exist. I do believe there was some back channeling. And, I think maybe Maduro kind of overplayed his hand or assumed that there would be greater popular resistance or military resistance to any attempt at, military intervention by the United States.
It's striking to me on a sort of a personal level that I feel a little bit aggrieved, right? And I'm not doing the kind of like two things can be true at the same time thing here. But if you look at, other leaders that, the US has deposed, if you look at like Allende, or if you look at Arbenz, to put Maduro, who by my estimation was like, especially in the last few years, always kind of a joke, in their company now by default is really like, there's something farcical about it to me. And I don't know. Do you think I'm sort of justified in that?
Yeah, well, again, we're living in the post-truth world right now. Obviously, sort of, this idea of, Maduro is certainly to call Maduro's regime sort of democratic socialist. I would consider it a post-truth, right? If it was, but at the same time, again, and this is sort of me stepping back and taking more of a political approach as, a leader of the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, I don't think it's our role as socialists within the American empire to be kind of like criticizing or analyzing very deeply kind of these regimes, right? Like our role is to stop the intervention, stop the sanctions, have solidarity with the working classes of these countries around the world, right? But I mean, yeah, clearly you can't put it on the par with Allende, like he literally, he developed autonomous working class power, right? Venezuela, I think, again, under Chavez, there was huge advances made in social programs, poverty reduction, minimum wage increases, even food sovereignty issues. But what happened, Chavez also didn't kind of prepare the conditions sort of materially for when the commodities boom would end, right? And literally 2 years after Chavez died in 2013, commodities boom and, the sanctions start getting slapped on. So, the PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan nationalized oil company, can't get access to like the parts and the machinery they need to keep ramp up production more to compensate for the drop in oil prices. And then everything, that was kind of based on, that wasn't based on ideology, but was based on sort of just this capacity of the Venezuelan government to materially provide better for its citizens, that completely collapsed. And so then Maduro, he starts, I think again, a lot of the Venezuelan people still follow him legitimately because of this sort of political memory of how their lives materially improved under Chavez in particular. But at the same time, like he's not trying to, create independent working class power in the same way that Allende did, without a doubt.
So what I want to talk a little bit about with the time we have left is the day after. So what do we think is based on understanding two things, understanding American intervention in Latin and South America on the one hand, and also understanding American attempts at, I'm not going to say necessarily nation building, because they may just end up governing via like the vice president. For example, like the state may stay somewhat intact. We don't actually know yet, really. But what do we think the likely day after looks like for Venezuelan society having just had its government removed?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, we've already seen the day after, right? And what we've seen so far is actually, it's surprisingly calm, right? I think there was a lot of sort of these right-wingers wish casting that the so-called Democrats of Venezuelans inside the country would rise up and, overthrow the entire Chavista regime, including the vice president. That certainly hasn't happened. And we've seen obviously how, what Trump feels about, our wonderful Nobel Peace Prize winner, Corina Machado. And then on the other hand, I think, it's still really an open question what can happen next, sort of in the next weeks or months or even years to come. Unfortunately, as we were talking about kind of the recent history of Latin America, there's also this trend, right, of kind of vice presidents completely sort of abandoning the political projects that they were elected under, right? This obviously happened by Michel Temer, who was the vice president who led the coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. But that also happened, 1 or 2 years later in Ecuador. Lenin Moreno, who was Rafael Correa's, the left-wing Rafael Correa's vice president, he gets elected once Rafael Correa can't run again due to term limits. And he completely, and literally in the space of weeks, turns on a dime and implements neoliberal policies, and and a lot of Rafael Correa tries to indict Correa himself under corruption charges, etc. So all that to say, even though Delcy Rodriguez, the current acting president of Venezuela, has impeccable Chavista credentials, right? She has never in any moment whatsoever shown to not be loyal to the regime, right? But anything can happen, right? And she has a boot on her neck, very literally. Trump has made it very clear that we'll work with her if she does what we want her to do. So I think there's a lot of difficult choices that, her administration right now is going to have to face. I think the reality is, even though Maduro was, arrested, under a flagrant breach of international law, and is going to be tried in the United States in a way that completely undermines any concept of what we call, a sovereign immunity for heads of state, for crimes that are not considered, you can only basically try a sovereign head of state for 3 crimes, right? When they're in office, which would be war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. That's why it would be possible to try someone like Netanyahu right now. But you can't try Maduro, especially in a foreign court, for crimes committed supposedly in his own country. We're talking about, possession of arms, possession of firearms. That's not a crime in Venezuela, right? So,
It's a crime in America.
It's not even a crime in America, right? And that's why I don't live in the United States anymore, among other reasons. But anyway, I think so Maduro, but I think despite all the blatant illegality, he's not going to be coming back to Venezuela anytime soon, maybe not at all. So I think the reality is going to be, how is Rodriguez going to respond to these threats? How is she going to be able to kind of thread the needle, right? Is she going to be able to attend, is she going to open up U.S., to U.S. investment in the oil sector, which is obviously seems to be, the main interest? Is she going to try to do something in terms of blocking, quote unquote, illegal immigration of Venezuelans to the United States? I think if she does those two things, then maybe the United States will kind of just let her be, right? right? But and then the other open question, obviously, is like, supposedly, again, the left in Latin America thought for a very long time, Venezuela is the best prepared country to, confront a U.S. military attack or any kind of attack because, again, they have the Comuna movement. They had, a lot of organized, popular social movement, unions, women's groups, etc., community groups. But so far, they taken to the streets, but they weren't able to prevent the attack. There obviously was probably some kind of leak that, was able to get the, get the CIA, get the DAA in there to be able to, abduct Chavez so effectively. So all that to say that, I think, again, we're going to have to look at the sort of correlation of forces between, popular pro-Chavista forces versus the pressure of the United States and how Delcy Rodriguez is going to thread that needle.
Yeah, I mean, do you, and I know we're sort of getting into speculation here, but one possible future outcome is as you say, just sort of total capitulation by Delcy Rodriguez. The sort of government carries on as normal.
Total incoherence of like MAGA communism.
But also, like, for example, that there could be like an ongoing sort of low-level security crisis as, like, let's say you haven't tried to take apart like Chavista institutions. You haven't sort of destroyed a lot of these organized groups that could, for example, object in quite strong terms to Chevron increasing its staffing from like 3,000 people in country as was to 20,000, 25,000 to American oil companies taking much more control and much more profit and so on, right? Like, I wonder what the prospects are of, say, for example, a sort of ongoing low-level insurgency that gets funded by, every side of it gets funded by different arms of the U.S. security state. And you end up like with, the DEA's guys fighting the CIA's guys in order to take territory from the DOD's guys.
Turning Venezuela into Syria, you mean?
Basically.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, that's less possible to turn it into a Syria because, again, you don't have these like ethnic, religious cleavages, etc., like you do see in countries like Syria or Lebanon, right? That lets the U.S. kind of go in and kind of exploit those differences. Second of all, I think this is where the ideology is going to come into play, right? Like, are the Venezuelan people or the majority of Venezuelan people, the 65% or so living in Venezuela that oppose U.S. military intervention, willing to, put their bodies on the line, against U.S. military, further U.S. military intervention or economic intervention? I think that remains to be seen, right? Like we said, we see protests in the street, we see the loyalists, out there, we see them in, social media, etc. But when push comes to shove, I think that remains to be seen, what the reaction, not just of the government is going to be, but of the Venezuelan people themselves, especially those kind of organized in these comuna movements or union movements, etc. And I have my doubts, because again, on one hand, I had the experience, living in Brazil in 2018. I spent some time in the border region between, where the northern part of Brazil shares the border with Venezuela in a state called Roraima. And I spent some time there talking with recent Venezuelan refugees, right, migrants. And, most of them really weren't very ideological one way or the other. Like, they were leaving the country because, like, I was talking to teachers, policemen, even, petroleum engineers who are like literally their monthly salary because of hyperinflation was only like letting them buy, 3 frozen chickens and some like cornmeal, and they couldn't have access to medicine, right? So, I would say people are really just looking to survive. Like, I think most people in Venezuela are looking to just kind of turn this page and like be able to have better lives within the country because there is a huge humanitarian crisis that is undeniable, even though, Maduro has tried to kind of like paper over that. So I think if, this new sort of U.S. presence in whatever form it's going to be, kind of mediated by Rodriguez, it starts to improve the material conditions of people, including access to food and medicine in particular, they're not going to protest against that. But again, this is all speculation, so we'll wait and see.
And of course, obviously, just to be clear, the thing that would remove the crisis is that, of course, now that there is a friendly U.S. leader, the U.S. would just let them back into the global economy, basically. Right.
But unfortunately, so far, no immediate sanctions have been lifted. And even the European Union has decided not to lift their sanctions, in support of quote unquote democracy until 2027. So, yeah, I think there's going to have to be movement on that.
Yeah.
It's just, I think the thing that's most remarkable about all of this, and the thing that makes it so unpredictable, is that there is a kind of like established neoliberal playbook for regime change, which has just been, for the most part, completely discarded. And so you had this kind of like, sort of like democracy movement or whatever with Machado that is just now completely sidelined. The European sort of like pathway for all of this is also now kind of at the mercy of whatever Donald Trump decides to do, or whatever Marco Rubio decides to do. And it's just, I mean, on those two fronts, I feel like it couldn't happen to nicer people. But it's so bizarre from start to finish.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, again, world, we can say what we want about Trump, but they have, world leaders aren't dumb, right? They have their eyes open, right? They realize what the complete, failure of the Arab Spring was. Like, they see, what Syria turned into, what Egypt turned into, et cetera, right? They saw, the failure of the color revolutions in places like Ukraine, right? They don't want another Ukraine. So I think this, especially these sort of neo-authoritarian right-wing governments like the Trump administration in particular, but obviously we can include that Meloni, Orban and others. Yeah, they just want to cut to the chase. They want to just, let's get what we want. And, this whole veneer of democracy is really, or like popular participation maybe is not necessary at all.
Like at the time of recording, Rubio, like just to sort of bring this back around, put a little button on it and then transfer back to us. Rubio is saying elections. Oh, that's premature. No.
Amidst both him getting his sort of like mandatory Cuba threatening in, but also Trump extending this in his own mind to Colombia, to Mexico, and maybe to Greenland.
Yeah, and like, when was the last time we had elections in Ukraine? Let's remember that too.
Yeah, let's. If you're Mark Carney, you really should be kind of trying to get some technicals built.
Mark Carney employing a bunch of Cuban special forces as bodyguards now that they're out of work.
Yeah, but one guy's just like, my uncle was the previous guy. You took over from him. Anyway, Jana Silverman, I want to thank you very much for coming and talking to us a little bit about the history, local context, and likely future of one of the most shocking and downright confusing developments in global politics today.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun, and I hope I was able to shed a little bit of light on this very, very crazy and chaotic situation.
Perfect.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
And now, back to us for some further speculation on what's going to be happening. See you in a moment.
Wow. Great job, us.
And this time, we actually do know about that because we already did that before recording this part, which is unusual for us. So basically, one of the things I want to go back to is just a little bit of MAGA Kremlinology. And there are lots of different ways to sort of thread this needle.
There's so many potential actors here. You can do like Hegseth being like, these guys that like make me feel funny to do pull-ups with, and deciding to like sort of really throw in heavily with Delta. Or you can look at the kind of MAGA foreign policy, right? Because the kind of like ostensibly anti-war MAGA like wing, that's out, that's washed, it's over. And instead, it feels like the patriots in control now are Marco Rubio, because he got what he wanted. He got a regime change in Latin America, and he got to threaten Cuba with one.
And it's very amusing, to look at the reactions out of Miami, where in the morning they're just like celebrating in the streets.
This is beautiful, right? Because every news organization in the world sent reporters to the same like 4 blocks of Doral, Florida, right, to interview like the wealthiest and most obscenely fascist Venezuelan emigres they could find. This isn't to say that like everyone who fled Venezuela it's just these guys are, and they're the ones they're talking to. They found the blondest Venezuelans and they went, okay, what's up with this? How are you feeling? In the morning, ecstatic, fantastic. Trump is a great liberator. He's a great man. And then as the penny drops that they're not really going to do like a regime change per se, they just grabbed one guy and his wife, and then they're going to try and like kind of do an occupation by Zoom call. That reaction got more and more confused and a little bit betrayed. Funniest pathway to a Trump assassination is somebody who feels like they got Bay of Pigs about Venezuela.
Which is like a bunch of like blonde Venezuelans with German last names just start like doing fucking like tire obstacle courses in like the Louisiana Bayou.
I thought it was weird that Donald Trump got perfectly air-hauled by a Car 98K, but I guess they had that on hand for a normal reason.
Well, no, I mean, there's a reason every now and again a guy named Juan Carlos Eichmann just happens to buy a long-range rifle, like doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think it's crazy that Juan Carlos Eichmann went to go see Avatar 4 immediately after doing Trump. I don't think that makes any sense. I think he's a patsy. And he just revealed his location from his TikToks.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we can break it down by the seconds. He enters into the DoorDash dark kitchen, pulls out this long rifle. Yeah, it's just curtains from there.
Yeah. So we have this MAGA criminology where, I mean, I think you can always say, right, like someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is surprised and disgusted by this surprising and disgusting action, is and always was a patsy, that everyone who thought that MAGA was about, quote unquote, no more foreign wars was a patsy.
Well, they're all cynics and they're stupid at the same time, right? So she's kind of worked out that there's some hay she can make off of this for like a kind of splinter, like sort of right MAGAism, I guess, of like sort of anti-interventionism, which sure, but like she's out is the main thing. She is out with the big guy, and as the big guy seems progressively more frail, it really seems like you can kind of get some Death of Stalin stuff by him a lot more easily.
Which is, I think we can then say, well, what Rubio did. And
because it was never like, is he going to do something? It was, because Trump is the fascist that he is sort of like venal. He does love violence. He loves crime. But it's like, which one, right? This could just as easily have been Mexico. That was one of the things that Hegseth was apparently big on. And I get the sense that it was Rubio who steered things towards Venezuela instead.
And it's government by like who's able to like befriend the dentist that Trump is golfing with that day.
Yeah,
at Mar-a-Lago so you can
navigate this
them.
addled old man's crumbling mind palace. Like it's succession shit is what it is.
I mean, it's also like this is you talk about like Fourth Reich stuff. Like this is what it would have been like trying to influence if you're like it's like an ambitious young German officer. This is what it would have been like in like 1970s Lebensraum Germany.
Sort of working towards the Führer, absolutely.
Yeah, also, like we talk about like the love of violence, and I want to get also to especially to the European reaction after this.
Not to keep cutting you off here, I'm sorry, but like the other thing about this that I think is funny, and partially why I had the thought of like woke SEAL team is as much as we can talk about how this is like as we said in the interview, it conforms to the long history of like sort of American exercise of military force, but it's different in that it's more brazen. Trump is kind of doing the Trump version of the same thing that Obama did, which is second term getting really enamored with special forces guys as just like, this is going to solve all my problems. And it's sort of like where that energy gets directed and who by is an interesting question. But I also think at this point, like for him, it's TV. He said that as much. He said that, that he was watching it like it was on TV, which is something Obama did with the Osama bin Laden thing. And I genuinely think there is a way to make the world safe for America, which is you just get Japanese airsofters to do fake Delta raids for Trump on TV. You give him a busy box. Those guys are really good at like replicating the like details of gear and stuff. Just have them do that. Give the Japanese airsofters a Black Hawk and have them entertain Trump with it for the next 3 years.
Like Truman Show where Trump basically is endlessly entertained by, I don't know, Potemkin Delta Force. And basically he'll be too enthralled. He won't be able to do anything else and make any more problems for people.
It's a sort of total Baudrillard victory, right? In the all of this stuff is so choreographed and so stage managed that and sort of like almost ritualized that it may as well not happen as far as the guys ordering it. And I mean, like needs go.
Seeing grainy cell phone footage of MH60s over Caracas, I feel like you could just do the Dark Souls font and write total Baudrillard victory on that, and it would completely summarize the situation.
So basically we have the MAGA criminology, which is like as ever, right? The interventionists, the neocons are back in charge. The only reason Trump didn't like the neocons was that some of them he found to be personally unpleasant.
Yeah, well, the neocons have had to adopt sort of Trumpian methods, right? This is sort of something that like, it isn't necessarily the way they would have done it themselves, but it also seems for them to be working better than the old playbook. So in that sense, Trump is useful to them.
But I want to also talk a little bit about someone you already mentioned, Nova, the hyper-cucked Europeans.
the most washed continent on the face of the fucking planet.
Oh, yeah. Like you might as well have like the European Union Commission seat at the UN. It's the chair in the corner of a hotel room at this point. That's just what that is.
And to be clear, right, this isn't because Europeans are pussies. Well, it is, but like not in the sense that we're horrified by the abuse of international law, right? Europe loves breaking international law, same as everyone. But what it is that there's a playbook for this stuff. There's a way it's meant to go. There's meant to be a kind of like credible opposition movement. That's what the Nobel Prize was for. That's what there's a way you're supposed to do this that requires a certain amount of delicacy. And instead of doing that, Trump just kidnapped the guy into a flying black van. And so what you're left with is all of these kind of stammering statements of like, well, the United States is our strongest ally and we're looking into whether or not it was okay that they did that. Probably it was.
So, for example, I'll start with Starmer's statement. The UK has long supported a transition of power in Venezuela. We regarded Maduro as an illegitimate president, and we shed no tears about the end of his regime. I reiterate my support for international law this morning. So fucking foam finger. Law.
It's nice to know that the sort of like center right has an equivalent to when leftists say solidarity with X of just being like, you're on your own.
So we discuss the evolving situation with U.S. counterparts in the days ahead, and we seek a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. The PM refused to say whether President Trump had broken international law, saying he needs to, quote, establish the full picture. And it's like, I know you have to say that, but it must be I hope he feels at least a little bit embarrassed that the human rights lawyer prime minister of the UK watches, like, as we established with Jana in the interview, just like radioactively illegal kidnapping on foreign soil for like thrown together like gun and drug charges. Like he's fucking like young thug. And then just saying, oh, we don't know. We don't know if this is actually breaking international law. We need to establish the full
looking
picture.
at the most illegal thing you've ever seen and going, well, what is truth anyway? And that's why it's a total Baudrillard victory, is because now Europe is in this position of being like, well, the meaning of international law is highly subjective, you know? Can any of us be said to know something, truly?
Maybe Starmer really wishes it was him. Maybe he was like, I can also wear a tracksuit.
I would support Starmer being kidnapped by Delta Force. I think I can say that.
But I was going to say, but like, yeah, it's sort of an interesting moment because like there's now a non-zero chance that like the US could just kind of like occupy Whitechapel if it believes that it's got a like responsibility to like take out grooming gangs or whatever and like kidnap Keir Starmer as part of that process.
They are going to kidnap Starmer for like censoring X.com, the everything app.
All that, yeah, and then Keir Starmer can be like, well, actually, I quite enjoyed it. It was a very nice experience. They were very Delta Force. They're very strong guys. You know, they're very very.
Yeah, you'll actually find they're quite woke, but not too woke.
They gave me a nice water on the plane.
Starmer being zipped into the mandatory punitive Nike tracksuit, and he's just like, this is just like playing five-a-side, a thing I do regularly.
They had adolescents in the in-flight video system, which I thought was very important.
Fucking economy class gets worse every year, you know?
So in the European Union itself, with people like Kaja Kallas or Ursula von der Leyen are also saying basically the same statement, which is, we support what you did, but we're worried about it. We support what you did because we know that, you know, Maduro is the designated enemy. Boo.
Yeah, well, the sort of, again, like, I'm not a child, right? I understand that all international law operates this way, and this is just how states are, but it is a particular humiliation to sort of make Ukraine also be like, yeah, I guess that's crazy. Total support for the US, whatever they want, because they have to say that when, like, the Russians tried to do this to Zelensky. That's what the Battle of Hostomel was them trying to do this and making the crucial mistake of not having sort of prior agreement from the rest of the Ukrainian government, and it didn't go so well. So I mean, I guess that's the other kind of on the list of like haters and losers here. Russian airborne forces watching this and being like, damn, it's much easier if you like ask first, huh?
Yeah. And on top of that as well, right, you can't ignore the fact that Trump, emboldened by the great TV that this produced and the sort of most hawkish of his administration's members.
The last movie he saw about anything, and whose courtier's power is mostly like exercised through which film to show him, could be by inclination he's naturally like a musicals guy. If you showed him like The Apartment or like a screwball comedy, you would get a kind of a good-natured Trump. But instead somebody fucking showed him Sicario, and now we have to now we are all gonna get black bagged, every single one of us individually.
The DOD produced a musical version of Sicario. In Colombia, I worked as a prosecutor. That was fucking illegal.
They always make me do the patter songs at productions of Sicario. It sucks.
I'm just trying to think of another Sicario musical line. No, I think we're good on that one. If you think of any more Sicario musical lines, please do just sing them.
Yeah, but not Sicario 2. Just Sicario.
Yeah, Sicario. Well, Sicario 2 is the better musical. It's the worst movie. Because the other... having seen now Sicario the musical, Trump or Trump allies like Stephen Miller's wife are doing the same thing about Greenland. And once again, she's posting American
There's
Greenland.
There's to fucking black bag out there. Like you're gonna sort of like fly them out there. They're gonna crash one of the helicopters, as is tradition, and then like a bunch of guys are gonna slip and fall on ice trying to black bag. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me.
This is still them, right?
Prime Minister of Greenland, Jens Frederick Nielsen.
Yeah.
Who I guess apparently is into narco trafficking or something.
Yeah. And it's the same line also that's been deployed against Canada, against Mexico.
Jens Frederick Nielsen, a serious badminton player, Marty Supreme Prime Minister.
And now the question is, which of the... Are you going to show Trump the Bon Cop, Bad Cop musical? Like, which Trump musical are you going to show him? They're going
to show him Canadian bacon.
Yeah, God. They're going to show him Bob and Doug McKenzie. We got to stop Bob and Doug McKenzie. Again, and this is sort of focusing on the utter strategic and increasingly economic irrelevancy that is the European Union, which is, what are you going to do about it? Because are you going to equivocate the same way when they do the same thing to Greenland? Are you just going to allow Denmark, one of the most historically Atlanticist European countries, to just get invaded and taken over because you don't know what else to do?
I can give you the answer to that. It's yes. Yeah, they are going to do that. Yes,
that's exactly what they're going to do.
The Danes are going to cope and seethe, I believe, is the calculation. And again, because it's a sort of vulgar exercise of power, the White House knows this, and that's so one of the reasons why they're keen to do it.
But then also the parallels are just, too acute. Can Starmer resist the urge to have his own Falklands moment when he decides to recreate the Falklands by fighting America and Greenland? I don't know.
But I think the funniest option is we go in on our other military tradition of joining the Americans for no reason on their military adventures, and it's a joint US-UK invasion of Greenland for no reason, in which like two paras get frostbite and we kind of like cover ourselves in glory that way.
Yeah, and then we realize our power grid is down because the Danish had Stuxnet on all of the offshore wind terminals. Just like all the turbines just explode. They're like dandelion fucking petals going everywhere. Like no more wind power.
It's like how's 2026 going? And I'm like watching the like Danish hypersonic missiles going overhead heading towards London.
I also love the idea of like the Danish Taliban. Like I want to know what like Danish nasheeds sound like.
Yeah,
there we go.
I was gonna say that. Yeah. Oh my God.
The Danish Taliban, a thing JD Vance 100% believes
Well, yeah,
exists.
the problem is, I mean, just laughing about it too, because it's just like they'll try to stamp out Ozempic production, but they'll be able to set up labs in the tribal lands of Denmark on Jutland. They're growing all the precursors to make Wegovy, and like they'll keep funding terrorism that way.
And I just wanted to discuss one more thing before we sort of end off the first episode of the year.
What
Cheerful.
a fucking stupid start to the year, and I assume this will continue.
Yeah, is going back a little bit to some of the claimed justifications, which we touched on with Jana, right? Which was most of it is about like trying to oust Chinese influence from South America, like trying to remove them as primary trading partners by force. I mean, one thing also to remember is that the last time the U.S. Sort of engaged its Monroe Doctrine reflex, it was a growing and increasingly powerful economy that was still desirable to trade with if you were going to trade with anybody.
I think as far as the Chinese angle goes, it's interesting to me. There was a Chinese delegation in Caracas set to meet with Maduro, and then the Americans just kidnapped him instead. So adding to the list of haters and losers, China once again falling for the eating the chess pieces strategy. And I think like what this means for sort of like multipolarity, what this means for like Taiwan or whatever, doesn't have anything to do with international law, because as we know, like any state will discard that the second they need to, and nobody's kind of relying on the US obeying it. But I think you can't keep teaching all of your enemies the world over that the only way to succeed is to act recklessly and unilaterally without some of them doing it. And I think that's going to be the big challenge in like Chinese foreign policy, whether that's like internally to Xi or just sort of like something that he incorporates into his own worldview, is you have to just do it. Like much like the Nike tracksuit that they sort of non-consensually put you in, you have to do it. And if you're not that guy, you have to get someone who is.
There's like a kind of high watermark of stupid and unpredictable that everybody must conform to.
Well, like if you look at the kind of the Chinese policy of like coercion without violence, of the like in relation to Taiwan, of doing all of these exercises and being like, oh, I'm not touching you. But for real, you do have to do what I say though. And then look at sort of what the US is doing. It's got to be hard not to feel a little stupid, you know?
We could have, like, we have all these black bags. We make them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also I wanted to talk a little bit about like some of the goals, right? Because oil is discussed very frequently. I mean, it's discussed by Trump.
Most notably.
Yeah. But the actual economic incentives to take over and scale up Venezuelan oil production on behalf of American companies are kind of odd.
Yeah, they're not great, because Venezuela has a lot of like heavy sour oil, which is difficult to refine. That's something the US is good at. Like this sort of business flow there is the US imports your cheap, shitty oil and sort of refines it. But also, after years of sanctions, the Venezuelan oil industry is sort of in pieces. And it's one of those things where if Trump is saying the war is about oil, you can believe him, but that doesn't mean that it has to make sense economically. It's just something that he believes that can also be wrong.
I saw this described, which I thought was very interesting, as like mercantilism cosplay.
Yeah,
right?
We're going to go there and we're going to get the oil. And then you look at what sort of American oil companies feel about this, and the answer appears to be pretty ambivalent.
Yeah.
It's just like you work in Houston in an entirely glass-walled office that's being air-conditioned to death. You're slowly sort of like dehydrating yourself in there. And then the federal government kicks your door in and goes, do you want to do the plot of Mercenaries 2? Say yes now. Like,
yeah.
What?
Yeah, especially because, right, like this is something we've talked about recently, which is guess where all the capital expenditure is going, especially in like power generation. It's going to like fucking data centers. It's like, hey, we're not doing data centers anymore. We're rebuilding the Venezuelan oil industry almost from scratch. And guess what? You're going to do it. By the way, to do it, I was reading this in the FT, as I so often am, is going to take the combined capital expenditure of 3 major American oil companies over a period of 10 years.
I bet they're just thrilled about that.
Especially at a time of, you know what it is? Invading Venezuela for the sake of the of American oil companies that should have happened. Like, that's a zero interest rate phenomenon. Like, that should not, if from purely that perspective, it was like, where were you in term one doing this? Why didn't Rex Tillerson take advantage of zero interest rate? He was too busy doing the sword dance. And so, like, the whole thing is, it is a crime. It's a stupidity. It's making the world it's a farce. It's making the world a profoundly more dangerous place. And when I say for no reason, I don't mean for no good reason, as there was and cannot be a good reason for this kind of thing, but not even for a reason that makes sense, really, when you look at like the hegemon stated claim.
It's just libidinal. It's TV. You know, it's a guy who kind of understands that oil is a profitable commodity to trade and that Venezuela has a lot of it, and enjoys the kind of sadism of seeing a guy who he believes insulted him by stealing his Trump dance get kidnapped.
Yeah. I don't know. It's weird for me because I'm so out of that world now. I mean, I've been out of the military for almost 12 years now, and it's just hideous. It's just genuinely hideous. Like, Caracas is one of the most densely populated cities in Latin America, and the idea of them, doing airstrikes, probably air defense suppression strikes, but still, like, killing soldiers, killing civilians, doing this completely illegal thing. And that doesn't even, like, not that there could be a good reason for it, but like, that doesn't even accomplish anything but a spectacle. Like, it's horrifying. It's genuinely horrifying. We joke because, like, that's one of the ways you cope with it, but that's not to downplay the seriousness or like the absolute moral hideousness of it, man. Like, I don't really have words for it other than like I can't believe I'm seeing this. And I said it to a friend, like, it just feels like the recurring theme of our lives, our adult lives, is you wake up and you're like, oh, they did the fucking insane thing that I thought they weren't going to do because it'd be too crazy to do it, but they did it anyway.
I have a vain hope where I'm like, I should be pessimistic about this, but I'm like, I can't wait for Donald Trump to be brought to justice. I don't know what that looks like, but something.
Zoran Mamdani's going to kidnap him. That's my thinking. But the long game is very much we're building a New York army to kidnap him.
Well, the problem is if you get kidnapped by New York Delta Force, they like non-consensually put a pair of Timbs on you.
I was going to say, actually, I think it's the opposite situation, is that Zoran Mamdani is going to exercise so much like, charm and soft power on Trump that he's actually going to convince Trump to authorize a Delta Force strike on himself. Like, I mean, really, man, like, we kind of just got to, we believe in restorative justice, but, you kind of got to make amends and, but do that in Zoran Mamdani voice. And then Trump basically, like the fucking 160th soars dropping dudes onto the White House to carry his ass off to, I don't know, Slovenia. Who knows?
I'm taking accountability, and I'm not going to do a notes app post. Fire on my coordinates. Danger close. DJT calling in a strike on my coordinates. Those are my initials.
Well, yeah, like you're completely right, just in the sense of like, I think there was this more innocent time where it's just like, yeah, they can't be that insane. They won't do that. I mean, it's like, no, they are. And like, so much of it is just kind of, I think if there's like a real, we talked about this in the interview a little bit, but like my kind of feeling about, or like my sort of understanding of kind of elite commentators who are desperately still trying to kind of convince themselves that like there was sort of a political like objective to getting rid of Maduro, and it was about like, restoring democracy. And look, we don't kind of, we see Maduro as illegitimate, and look at all these like Venezuelans with like blonde hair who are celebrating all of this that's happening, that, we're sort of bringing justice to people. But the reality, I think, is just like, I think the sort of flavor of this administration now, especially as it sort of reaches a point where it is like deeply unpopular, both internationally and like domestically, where so much of like the domestic policy that the agenda that they've had like isn't working, whether that's in terms of like bringing down costs of like food or costs of energy, resistance to ICE in various cities. This may be a stretch, but I also kind of think that like the whole sort of like the conservative anti-woke thing is kind of, we're going to see some interesting moments with that, because, the end point of last year was like a conservative split, which this intervention and this kind of continued, or this desire now to just like spread American war around South America will kind of continue to ignite, which is, a real schism among the American right over like Trump's ability to govern, but also like the objectives of the people around him. I think that's only going to get worse. And I think the point is being that like, we are now going to see an administration that is much more guided purely by like zero-sum games, of like how they calculate like who deserves vengeance and when and how, and like how severe, how willing are like countries like as a whole willing to submit to America and its power. And I think like the fact that like the fact that what we've seen is like an international system of governance basically never existed, or if it did exist, it just doesn't work anymore. But like what is left? I guess it comes back to the thing. We're in the time of monsters now, and that's cool because sometimes monsters are fun and interesting.
And I mean, all of this is going to get more intense after the midterms. But if seems likely, the Democrats take back the House, Trump gets kind of kneecapped domestically, and he just changes the channel to all Sicario all the time, everywhere. Greenland, I guess.
Yeah, and so in a very strange way, it'll be like, okay, well now the rest of the world, and like unfortunately, the rest of the world does include us. I think in the past it was very much like, the rest of the world is just it's Africa, or it's like the Middle East or whatever. Who cares? But it's like it's us.
I hope I get black bagged by the woke special forces. I want them to respect my pronouns.
Yeah. So, any case, I think what we're going to see as sort of just bringing it all back around, this isn't the first instance of government by what you want to watch on TV. And it certainly won't be the last. And I think that now the people who are making the TV that they want to watch got basically everything they wanted.
Yeah.
I think we're going to probably see more of it in the next sort of 6, 12, 24 months. And that the Europeans sort of just close your eyes and wait for Joe Biden's corpse to get reelected for his second term.
3 years.
Yeah.
3 more years of this minimum.
Yeah.
And I think also like it's worth noting too, but this isn't just like watching America. It's, this is now sort of given this is given, not that they sort of needed it, but like we're going to see a lot more, countries with military for like, try and do stuff that we initially thought was just like things that were likely to, like things that was like could happen, but like were unlikely to. So like, look at Taiwan, look at Kashmir. I think that's going to be like a very interesting thing to observe, especially as you have an India that is like basically on a much like the same trajectory as America in terms of just like, why don't we use the military for everything? Indian Delta, like Indian equivalent of Delta Force, like that's going to be fucking mental. Russia, I think, is another one as well. And like, the fact that like the Americans are just like very happy to just like admit that Ukraine, like they just don't care about Ukraine anymore. And like the effects that that's going to have on the European Union. Like this is I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I kind of like have to. This is fucked, man. This is going to be like insane. And I feel as if like no one's quite kind of prepared for that. And I think a lot of the sort of American, like all the sort of intelligentsia commentators in the States are still just trying to convince themselves that there is some sort of semblance of an international order. And all we need is like one election to like, get Trump to be sensible,
Well, I think we're gonna give odds on whether that's gonna happen in the coming months. But what a way to start 2026, and we'll see you in a few days on the bonus episode, which was planned for today, just to be clear. All right. Thank you, everybody, of course, for listening, and see you on the Patreon in a couple days. Bye.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.